Child and human sacrifice in the ancient world. I'm responding today to a question posed by a viewer at Paddington Soul in response to my earlier video on whether Christianity was all bad. I'll leave a link to that video below. I was perfectly willing to accept that it wasn't all bad, that Christianity had indeed made some positive contributions to society. Others in the comments section were somewhat less positive. But this particular viewer, at Paddington Soul, wanted to ask me a specific question which, in their opinion, might result in some positive points, some brownie points, for the Judeo-Christian tradition. He was asking about human/child sacrifice and whether the Judeo-Christian tradition, by ending such practices, had in fact made a significant contribution to the world. I'll let them outline their question here. I've tidied up the spelling and punctuation just a bit to make it a little easier to read. It's about the idea you have in the minute 5:45. My question would be, according to your knowledge, what was the world like before Judaism? I'm taking into consideration that Christianity comes from and even part of Judaism. As far as I know, for example, Mexico, before the Spaniards took Christianity there, the locals used to practice human sacrifices. In Peru, the last couple of years, there were some discoveries that suggest they sacrificed children. When I imagine the world before Judaism, I imagine it a lot more savage and violent, to the point that it's clear in my opinion that Judaism and Christianity made a big improvement in the world. Well, thanks for the comment and for the question. I initially replied by admitting my lack of knowledge in some of these areas, beyond a kind of superficial knowledge. I would have to do quite a bit of research to give this a thoughtful response. Despite the fact that this person seemed somewhat miffed that I wouldn't immediately do a video on this topic, taking this as some kind of confirmation of my biases, here today is my more considered response to the issue. I think I can address it by making a number of points. First of all, it's clear that there was indeed human and even child sacrifice in pre-Columbian America. It's also clear that there was human sacrifice in some of the cultures of the Mesopotamian region and the surrounding regions with which early Hebrew culture would have interacted. That's my first point. My second point, it's also true that following the Christian conquest of these pre-Columbian regions, the civilizations that existed there ceased human sacrifice. But it has to be said that this was largely because these cultures were virtually obliterated rather than that they were purified in some way of these practices. So I'm not sure that's 100% in Christianity's favour. But it's certainly true that human sacrifice ceased in those areas after the Christian conquest. My third point is this. It's certainly true that by the time Christianity arose in Israel, the practice of human sacrifice had been pretty much eliminated throughout the ancient world. Obviously not in pre-Columbian America, but elsewhere throughout the Middle Eastern and Mediterranean world. So I don't think Christianity can be credited with that achievement. It predates Christianity, clearly. But what about the Judeo part of the Judeo-Christian complex? So my fourth point then is this. There's certainly plenty of evidence in the Old Testament indicating that the Hebrew people came to believe that their God, Yahweh, was strongly opposed to human sacrifice, that he found this behavior, this practice, abhorrent. There are plenty of Levitical and Deuteronomic laws condemning the practice. This also suggests, though, that it was something that Israelites themselves struggled with. There'd be no need to outlaw this practice if Israelites themselves were not tempted towards them, perhaps under the influence of surrounding cultures and practices. My fifth point, and this is quite a long and complicated point. There is some evidence, in fact, that some Abrahamic people did at one time practice human and even child sacrifice. It may be, and I admit that this is somewhat speculative, it may be that the readiness with which Abraham was willing to sacrifice Isaac indicates that the practice was not unknown at the time. Certainly Abraham was willing to do it. You may interpret this story as Yahweh in fact outlawing this practice, but he doesn't actually do that here in this story. He doesn't make this an object lesson, thou shalt not sacrifice thy children. It's more about testing Abraham's faithfulness than it is about ending child sacrifice. There's no suggestion that what Abraham was about to do was wrong. There's also the somewhat troubling story of the sacrifice of Jephthah's daughter in Judges chapter 11. Jephthah, a judge of Israel, vows to sacrifice the first thing that comes out of his house if he is victorious in his battle against the Ammonites, which he is. Unfortunately, the first thing to come out of his house is his daughter, his only child, who leaves the house dancing to the sound of timbrels. When he sees this, Jephthah tears his clothes and cries, "Oh no, my daughter, you have brought me down and I am devastated. I have made a vow to the Lord that I cannot break." Kind of interesting that he blames his daughter, but that aside, he subsequently does indeed sacrifice her. God apparently has no objection to this. He certainly never expresses any objection. In fact, given the way that Yahweh once provided the ram for Abraham, maybe God is here providing the sacrifice for Jephthah to offer. Now this took place, purportedly, sometime between 1200 and 1020 BCE, the period of the Judges, just before the establishment of the monarchy, but long after Abraham and Moses. So this suggests that human sacrifice, while it may have been rare, may have been practiced occasionally, almost up to the time of King David himself. Certainly it seems to have been part of Israel's living cultural memory. Now, certainly at some point in the history of Israel, human sacrifice was explicitly forbidden. This clearly predates Christianity, so the end of human sacrifice can't simply be added to the pros in the column for Christianity. Such practices were already dying out long before Christianity came on the scene. My sixth point is also somewhat long and complicated, and that is that other cultures were also moving away from the practice of human/child sacrifice quite independently of Judeo-Christian influence. For example, ancient Egypt moved away from the practice over time around the end of the Old Kingdom, around about 2200 BCE, replacing it with more symbolic offerings. Human sacrifice is referenced in early Greek myths, but it seems to have been rare to non-existent by historical times. Certainly by the classical period, around about the 5th century BCE, human sacrifice was virtually non-existent and animal sacrifice predominated in religious rituals. Human sacrifice was never very common in Roman society, but it did exist in some early rituals. But by 97 BCE, the Roman Senate had officially outlawed the practice of human sacrifice. Perhaps it was necessary to do that because the Roman influence is extending into areas where perhaps human sacrifice still occurred. If we move outside Europe and the Middle East, in ancient China during the Shang dynasty, which is about 1600 BCE to 1046 BCE, human sacrifices were carried out in various rituals. But by the time of the Chu dynasty in 1046 to 256 BCE, so the next dynasty along, these practices had largely ceased, and they were also replaced with more symbolic forms of sacrifice. Of course, this is completely independent of any influence from either Judaism or Christianity. Certain indigenous groups in North America practiced some kind of ritual sacrifice. Apparently the Natchez people of the Mississippi region did. They sacrificed servants upon the death of a leader. But by the time of European contact, many of these practices had either diminished or been replaced with more symbolic rituals. And although this is probably more difficult to demonstrate and maybe more controversial, even in Aztec society there seems to be some indication that people were beginning to question the practice of human sacrifice even before the Spanish conquest. If we turn our attention to the continent of Africa, it's true that human sacrifice did die out on the African continent under the influence of Christianity and Islam. But this idea certainly did not originate within these traditions. But they certainly did facilitate the ending of this practice on the African continent. Looking at the practice of human sacrifice across the world, across a variety of cultures and civilizations, it seems that human sacrifice is a practice that tends to die out as civilization develops. Israel can't claim to be unique in this respect, and Christianity certainly can't claim to have originated this movement away from human sacrifice. Christianity inherited this aversion to human sacrifice from both the Hebrew and Greco-Roman cultures that surrounded it. Indeed, by the time the Israelites went down into Egypt around the 18th century BCE, human sacrifice in Egypt had already been replaced with more symbolic sacrifices. Certainly Christianity and Islam can both be given credit for ending the practice in Africa as part of its general civilizing process. That can go in Christianity's pros column. But Christianity itself is not the main reason for moving away from these practices in the first place. This seems to have taken place naturally in several civilizations across the world as these became more complex. It's just a part of becoming more civilized.